Hello. This video reviews feedback from the Vermont Land Use Review Board, or LURB, on the Rutland Regional Planning Commission's pre-application Regional Future Land Use Map, and then walks through the updated map that incorporates that feedback. Some information appears briefly on screen, and viewers are encouraged to pause the video to review details as needed. Under Act 181, all regional planning commissions are required to have a future land use map using standardized categories defined in state law. 4 categories, downtown center, village center, planned growth area, and village area, are tied to the state designation program, and in some cases, certain Act 250 exemptions. As part of this framework, the Vermont Land Use Review Board was created to review and approve regional future land use maps. The RRPC developed a pre-application map in coordination with all 27 municipalities in the region and submitted it to the LURB. The LURB provided written feedback on that map. This video first reviews the region-wide feedback from the LURB, then the updated regional map, and finally, a town-by-town review of LURB feedback and map changes. The LURB gave feedback both on the map as a whole and on each of the 11 categories. We'll start with the general feedback that applies across the region, then walk through the comments for each category. This will help explain what changed and why. The LURB's general revisions focused on simpler boundaries, parcel-based alignment, and more cohesive mapping that clearly reflects state planning intent. They asked us to remove very narrow or unusual areas caused by overlapping data sets. Boundaries should be smooth and aligned with parcel lines where possible to make the map clearer. Now that we've covered the general feedback for the entire map, let's walk through the LURB's feedback for each category across the region. For downtown centers and village centers, the LURB largely agreed with RRPC's mapping, but in some cases recommended changes or requested additional information. A common theme was to reduce boundaries limited to road frontage, and instead align boundaries with parcels, adding depth to historically linear village centers. For planned growth areas, state law requires they must be served by municipal sewer or water. LURB noted that the RRPC had limited boundaries to the mapped service area and recommended extending them to include whole parcels. If water or sewer is available along any part of a parcel, the LURB said that the entire parcel could support development. For proposed village areas adjacent to the planned growth areas, the LURB found that they should be subsumed by the planned growth area category or recategorized if ineligible. For proposed village areas not adjacent to planned growth areas, the LURB recommended extending boundaries to include whole parcels rather than splitting the parcel. The LURB reinforced that planned growth areas and village areas are intended to be walkable to village centers and downtown. Most of the LURB's feedback focused on these 4 categories, which are tied to the state designation program and, in some cases, Act 250 exemptions. For the transition or infill areas, enterprise areas, resource-based recreation areas, and hamlets, the LURBs largely agreed with RRPC's approach, though they recommended changes or requested additional information in a few cases. For the rural categories, the LURB requested more cohesive mapping that clearly reflects the planning intent for each category. The draft map, however, relied on multiple data sets, creating isolated pockets and small slivers. The rural agriculture and forestry category reflected parcels in current use, breaking up ridgelines and floodplains that should be prioritized for conservation. Another example was the 300-foot buffer around all buildings, which produced isolated pockets and odd slivers. The LURB recommended that rural areas within state and federally mapped flood hazard zones be designated as rural conservation. In summary, the LURB's feedback called for a clear, more cohesive map with simplified boundaries aligned to parcels and reflecting the intent of each future land use map category. Now that we've reviewed the LURB's region-wide feedback, this section walks through how that feedback is reflected in the updated map. At a higher level, the updated future land use map follows a few consistent rules. Boundaries now generally align with parcel lines, except where geographic conditions require a split. Typically, floodplains. Floodplains are mapped consistently as rural conservation, except where state law allows them to fall within downtown centers, village centers, planned growth areas, or village areas. A major focus on the update was the rural categories. The LURB asked for rural districts that are more contiguous and more clearly aligned with statutory intent, rather than fragmented categories by overlapping data sets. Rural general now includes rural land on main roads, near villages, between villages, or in areas with relatively low development constraints. These are the rural areas most appropriate for future development. Rural agriculture and forestry focuses on contiguous clusters of agricultural land, based on land cover data, and generally away from main roads and villages. Development in these areas is still allowed, but should be designed to minimize fragmentation of agricultural lands. Rural conservation includes parcels with significant environmental constraints, such as forest blocks, wildlife corridors, steep slopes, and areas within state or federally mapped flood zones. Importantly, this category does not prohibit development, but development should be designed to minimize impacts and protect critical natural systems. Another major change involved the relationship between village areas and planned growth areas. Village areas no longer surround planned growth areas. In some cases, former village areas were absorbed into planned growth areas. In most cases, they are recategorized as transition or infill areas or rural general. This reflects LURB guidance that village areas should not be adjacent to planned growth areas. You'll see the effects of these changes in the comparison table. Planned growth areas increased in land area, primarily because snapping boundaries to parcels added depth beyond linear frontage. Transition and infill areas also increased as former village areas were recategorized. Rural conservation increased due to consistent mapping of floodplains, ridgelines, and forest blocks. Several categories decreased in land area. Village areas decreased because many had been adjacent to planned growth areas. Rural general decreased due to the removal of the 300-foot buffer around rural buildings and more consistent treatment of natural resource features. Rural agriculture and forestry also decreased because it is no longer tied to the current use program, and instead reflects actual clusters of agricultural land and forest. Finally, several categories experienced minimal changes. Downtown centers and village centers changed very little, as snapping to parcels resulted in only minor adjustments. Enterprise areas and resource-based recreation areas were already largely parcel-based. Overall, the updated map reflects a clearer, more cohesive future land use map that aligns boundaries with parcels, reflecting the planning intent of each category and responds directly to the LURB's region-wide feedback.